Welcome to Cisco Packet Tracer. In this lab, we're going to configure DNS, Domain Name System. It translates domain names to IP addresses so browsers can load internet resources. DNS uses both TCP and UDP port 53. If a packet is larger than 512 bytes, it uses TCP. If it's smaller than 512 bytes, it uses UDP. Now let's set up the network. Let's get a 2911 router. Let's get 2 switches. Let's get another switch. And let's get a server. And let's get our PCs. Let's connect the devices using a straight through cable because they're not like devices. As you can see, we have 3 networks. One network is in the 192.168.1.0/24 network. The other network is in 10.0.0.0/24 network. And the other network is in 20.0.0.0/24 network. When you connect the devices, remember the ports which you connected the switches. So we can start off by renaming the devices. Let's rename our first switch. Enable conft hostname switch 1. Let's also rename our server. We'll call server 0 here as server 1, SRV1. And let's name this server Google Server. And we'll name this server our DNS server. Let's connect the switch to the router. Remember to connect the switch to the router in the gigabit Ethernet ports. I'll connect it to gigabit 0/0. Now, let's give the switch, the VLAN 1, an IP address so it can communicate with the other devices. Interface VLAN 1 and the IP address. With the subnet mask. Give it the no shut command because by default the VLAN interface is in shutdown. Let's verify our command by the do show IP interface brief. As you can see, our VLAN is up. On the router, on the G0/0, let's also give it an IP address in the 192.168.1.0/24 network. We will assign our PCs in the DHCP. Let's connect switch 2 to the router. Let's give the switch an IP address. Interface VLAN 1. No shut. Let's verify. Do show IP interface brief. The do here allows you to see the show commands in global configuration mode. As you can see, we're up. Layer 1 and layer 2 is up. Let's assign our router an IP address. Let's connect our router to switch 3. Interface G0/2 and give it the IP address of 20.0.0.0.1/24 network. Keep in mind that routers are shut down by default. By default, Let's connect our server to the switch. Now, let's look at the running configuration on the router and look at our interfaces. Show run. As you can see, our interfaces have IP addresses, and the duplex is auto and speed is auto. Let's assign our servers IP addresses. I will give server 1 a .0. I will give our server 1 10.0.0.101/24 network with a subnet mask of 255.255.255.0. We'll also assign our server a default gateway of router 1, 10.0.0.1. Let's assign IP addresses to the Google server. Google server IP address is 8.8.8.8 for the DNS server. We'll assign this server an IP address of 10.0.0.0.102 with a subnet mask of 255.255.255.0. Let's also assign it a default gateway of router 1. Let's give our DNS server an IP address of 20.0.0.0.100. With a subnet mask of 255.255.255.0 and a default gateway of R1. Let's go on our router and set up a DHCP server. Let's do step 1. Config T. Let's first exclude the addresses, IP DHCP, and the excluded addresses. Let's now configure the DHCP pool. IP DHCP pool, pool 1 pool, and the range will be we're to hand out the network in the 192.168.1.0/24 network. Let's give it the default gateway. Let's also give it a DNS server, and this is our server in the 20.0.0/24 network. Let's go to our PCs and see if we got an IP address dynamically. ipconfig. As you can see, we don't have an IP address. ipconfig/renew. As you can see, we received our IP address, subnet mask, default gateway, and DNS server dynamically. Let's do the same to PC2, laptop 1. As you can see, laptop 1 received its IP address, subnet mask, default gateway, DNS dynamically. Let's try and ping server 1. Ping 10.0.0.101. As you can see, it's successful. Let's ping the Google server. 10.0.0.102. We're successful in pinging the Google server. Let's try now and ping server 1 by name. As you can see, it's not successful because our server does not have the logs. So let's go to the server. Now, by default, you would not usually set the IP address and the domain name. This will be done automatically. So let's go to our DNS server. Let's give our server a name, SRV1, an IP address in the 10.0.0.101. Let's add this. Let's go back to our device and try and ping server 1 by name. Give it some time to resolve this. Let's give our DNS server Let's troubleshoot this. Let's go to our configuration and check if the DNS server is correct. The DNS server is correct. 20.0.0.100. That's the IP address over a DNS server. The default gateway is R1, which is correct. We're not able to ping switch 1 because switch 1 does not have a default gateway of R1. Let's ping server 1. Let's check our configuration on switch 3. Our VLAN 1 does not have an IP address. Let's configure that. Let's also give it a default gateway of R1, the IP name server, IP default gateway, As I said before, Cisco Packet Tracer sometimes doesn't work, and I don't know why, because the configurations are correct. And our problem is the DNS server is not on. Let's put it on. Let's go back to the PC and try and resolve server 1 and ping server 1. As you can see, we have reply from the server. Let's ping the Google server. As you can see, we have reply from the Google server using the IP address and using the names and using the domain name. As you can see here, when we write ping Google server, it's pinging 10.0.0.102 network, which is the Google server.